ironically, this is actually not a bad thing for the climate. It's bad for people, right? It's bad for households. It's bad for inequality. Like it really like exacerbates social issues. But for the climate, if overall we consume less, or the other pathway I was going to say, like if we start manufacturing and producing more locally, for the climate, tariffs aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Hello everyone, I'm Deb Ryan and I'm joined today by my lovely co-host Theresa Hartman, and welcome to the next episode. Welcome to the next episode of Common Ground. Before we kick things off though, make sure that you subscribe to our channel to get all our upcoming episodes. So make sure you do that. Theresa, how are you?
I'm good. I am cooking. I'm sitting in Lisbon. It's super hot. We're at like 36 degrees Celsius. That's like just under 100 Fahrenheit. It's too hot.
That's hot. That seems hot for that part of the world as well.
It is hot for that part of the world, you know? Like it used to not get as hot as often, and like now in the last few summers you just see these like sustained heat waves, wildfires everywhere, and it just keeps going faster and faster. How about you?
Crazy. Sort of similar story here in Denver. We are used to it being quite hot. Denver is an arid sort of desert climate after all, but my poor garden is not doing very well at all. Normally by this time of the year, I would be harvesting lots of tomatoes and peppers and all sorts of things. And yesterday I got one little pitiful handful.
Yeah.
My poor vegetables are dying, but one tiny little pitiful handful of tomatoes yesterday. But not the kind of stuff, like not as much as we would normally get. So that's been a little bit, it's been quite hot and dry here as well this summer. So it's not great.
Yeah. No, it's not great. It's not great for your garden, but also like food security, right? Like this just makes me want to go like, where are we going to grow food if this continues to happen? Anyways, food is not the topic of today. Awkward transition. We wanted to talk about U.S. policy. There are lots of big pieces happening on climate and energy in the U.S. So Deb, I'm mostly going to be quizzing you because you are in the US and I am not. But there are kind of two pieces that stood out to me on the other side of the Atlantic. One was the report from the Department of Energy, and the other one was the EPA, who have proposed to rescind the fundamental, what's it called?
It's called the endangerment finding.
There we go, the endangerment finding.
Yep.
So are those the two big things that are on your mind?
They are. I've written a couple of pieces about these, and I'm working on another piece on the EPA one. And I actually also have an upcoming guest on the podcast to talk about some of it. He's a former lawyer, Bob Stout. So look out for that as well. We'll get into some of the legal things in the conversation with him. But yeah, no, there's been a lot of talk about both pieces, and it'll be interesting. I follow a lot of people on both sides of the equation, and so there's been different reactions as well. Some people are furious and some people are happy and some people are ambivalent. And so it will be interesting to sort of see as some of this plays out, where we kind of go and what actually does change and stuff like that. So
yeah, I do want to hear who's furious and who's not. But let's maybe start with what's in it. So the Department of Energy put out a report. And fundamentally, I mean, it starts with acknowledging that climate change is linked to human activities. It's a good thing, right?
Yep. It was one of the things I did a comparison of the DOE's report that was published at the end of July with the IPCC report from 2023, because they do reference that a lot for the DOE's, the Department of Energy's report. And the fact that the DOE report does acknowledge that increasing CO2 is from the burning of fossil fuels, I actually think can't be understated. We talked about it last time, but coming from the oil and gas industry, I hear from people all the time that they don't believe in climate change and they don't believe that, fossil fuels are the problem. And so the fact that the DOE has acknowledged that, I think, like I said, is a bigger deal than I think people have made out. It's then the rest of the findings in the report that I think allows the DOE and then subsequently the EPA to do some of what they're doing. So I know we'll get into that.
But so basically, I mean, there's always these two concepts, right? Like the first concept is there more CO2 and is that caused by human activity, right? And they've said yes, human activities like burning fossil fuels are increasing atmospheric CO2 levels. One.
Yep.
Point number two is the CO2 in the atmosphere actually causing global warming, right? And like that was also in the report, and it was also acknowledged that there has been warming across the world. as a result of
Yep.
increased CO2 levels.
Yeah, no, it's true. That has been acknowledged as well. I think for me, the big takeaway going through and reading that report, though, was that the findings that actually increased CO2 is not a problem. And we don't need to really worry about it. And the increased temperature is fine. And the irony, and this was pointed out by a lot of people that were against the report, Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, and Lee Zeldin, the Director of the EPA, were on Fox News talking about both the report and the endangerment findings a couple of weeks ago. And down in the little ticker on the news thing, it was talking about temperatures across the US. And again, places like Missouri having like 126 Fahrenheit, which, like the conversation about Lisbon and Portugal, Missouri should not be 126 Fahrenheit. So the hypocrisy and the irony of those two things juxtapositioned was pointed out by a lot of people. So,
just happening at the same time. Okay, so on the plus side, like the report does acknowledge that there's human-made climate change, right? And like me as a European, like I always think back to like that image of the senator on the floor of the Senate with a snowball. Like, I don't know when that was, 10 years ago, when he was like, climate change can't be real because we still have snow. So it feels like the conversation has moved beyond that, which is good. But then, as you say, so now we're not actually acknowledging that there's impacts from climate change. So like, if you look at the IPCC report, which you were reading, it says that there are significant impacts today that are impacting humans living on this planet. So it's like heat waves, extreme weather events, floods, all of that. What does the DOE say?
So a lot of it in terms of what was sort of written in the report was around the fact that it's not the increased CO2 that's necessarily causing the temperature, and that it's not really a problem. Like one of the main takeaways that they sort of talked about was the greening of the planet, and that if plants need CO2 to grow, then this increased CO2 is just going to be good for us growing food and growing plants and all this kind of stuff. But it doesn't acknowledge that, the challenges, like I said, my garden here in Denver is like burnt, like because the temperature's too hot. And I know that when I put stuff in a greenhouse, if it's too hot outside, everything in it just fries. My greenhouse is great here in Colorado in the winter when it's cold outside and we have some greenhouse gas warming and greenhouse effect. But in the summer, it's not great. And so I think I honestly do think it misses in that regard. I think it's and it's a challenge. There's also a piece in there about the Great Barrier Reef, and they reference and report some stuff that actually the Great Barrier Reef isn't as bad as it is. I'm from Australia. That's been something that's been a narrative my whole life about the bleaching of the coral reef, and they have some references and dispute some of those claims and the fact that they say it's actually reversing. And the irony is, like less than a week later, there's a report that came out from an institution in Australia that showed the continued decline of the reef. So there's a little bit of conflicting information in there, and a lot of the critics of the report and a lot of people that were actually referenced in some of their original science and with some of the authors of the IPCC report, they feel like the data was very cherry-picked to tell a story and not. So there's been a lot of back and forth in that regard about what data is being used to tell what story and how. And that, to be honest, that was the DOE's claim in the first place as well. So that back and forth is going on both sides, which is a challenge.
Yeah, the back and forth really is going on. I mean, like the IPCC, it's something like, north of 200 lead authors who produce an IPCC report, right? And then there's something like 700 reviewers and expert contributors, and they put together thousands of papers that they've written over years, right? And like, I was just looking up a stat, like there was something like 99% of like the published literature today attributes climate change to human activities, right? So like there's fairly broad consensus, and yet we constantly have these like disagreements over like who cherry picked that data. Do we know anything?
Really
I'm getting quite a bit of like sort of criticism on my feed about like the modeling that was actually done in the DOE report and like where the cherry picking happened. Like, is that part of discussion?
Yeah, there has been a little bit of it, but it sort of seems like it's quietened down a little bit. Because I'm really curious then, kind of what you're hearing from. Again, you and I have very different people and contacts and stuff in our feeds and some of that kind of stuff. So, kind of, what are you hearing around some of that? And are you hearing that same cherry picking conversation?
I am hearing the same cherry picking. Well, I mean, I'm hearing the what was it? So in my stats class, my professor used to say, like, show me which result you would like, and I'll like bend the data. So like that's basically the discussion that I'm hearing a little bit, right? As in like a lot of the analysis, so like for example on sea level rise, a lot of the analysis, like you can pick and choose a little bit, right? But like they were effectively looking at like trailing averages on sea level rise, right? And then saying that the trend doesn't show a clear upward trend. It does. It's just if you average it out over a long enough period, like you don't, or short enough.
Everything's flat.
Yep. Everything's flat. But yeah, so I mean, effectively, there's just a lot of like, who wrote this, who agreed on it,
Yep.
which methodologies did they use. So that's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
There was another piece that like really stood out to me in that report that was around the. I thought it was interesting because it said that the effect of U.S. policy was undetectably small. On
Yeah, they did.
yeah, which I find shocking, right? Because the U.S. has the highest CO2 emissions per capita. So like per population, per head count, it's the highest.
Yep.
It's the second highest. Like in absolute terms, it's the second highest after China. So I find it hard to believe that the U.S. changing policy would not have a massive impact on global temperatures.
Yeah. And I think some of that is potentially intentional, right? Because it then lends itself to some of this conversation that, okay, yeah, we've acknowledged that CO2 is increasing and that is caused by fossil fuels, but we're saying that policy and that increasing CO2 isn't going to change anything, so it's fine. Everything's fine. Like that's kind of my read on it a little bit, because it paves the way for some of the discussion around the EPA finding and rollback and stuff like that as well, which I think is an ongoing process, and I think that'll be I think we'll hear more about some of this as part of the EPA work. So it's not a done conversation at all. So the other thing that the administration's doing, and we're not going to talk about it in detail today, but they've announced that they're also going to go back and look at all of the past climate reports as well that the EPA has done. So we're not done with this review of climate science in the US by the DOE. So more to come.
So what's happening with the EPA at the moment? So basically, so in my previous life, I had not paid a lot of attention to the endangerment finding. So like, let's start there, and like, why is the endangerment finding so fundamental?
So and we have to go back quite a way, which is kind of, I don't know, this is the interesting piece to me to a certain extent in this, is that in 2009, the Biden administration was able to include greenhouse gas emissions as part of the Clean Air Act, partly because, or almost entirely because there was a Supreme Court finding in 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, where that court finding was stated that greenhouse gases were causing human harm. So that allowed the EPA, under the Clean Air Act, to roll greenhouse gases in as pollutants that need to be like regulated, essentially. And so that at the time, and I wasn't, full disclosure, I wasn't in the US in 2009. That's how long ago this was. I didn't move to the US until 2012. So we're talking about something that happened. I know, we are talking about something that happened 16 years ago under the Obama administration. And at the time, though, with what I've read and stuff, there was a lot of uproar from industry because it was the industries that have been very heavily regulated are particularly the automobile, power industries, oil and gas industry, some of these, fossil fuel generating industries. And so there was conversation at the time about massive, regulatory overreach. And this report from the DOE that says, yes, we've acknowledged that greenhouse gases is increasing, but we don't think it's causing human harm, is the way that they can start to go about rolling back the fact that the endangerment, the idea that CO2 endangers people and the environment, isn't happening as part of it. And so it's going to be an interesting process. The way that it works is at the moment they're just planning on rolling back the greenhouse gas emission requirements for automobiles. interestingly, they're keeping in, and I was digging around on this. The DOE report found that particulate matter, so non-greenhouse gases, are still should be regulated, and so because of that, the EPA is leaving in the particulate matter part of the endangerment finding and the EPA's regulation. So it's just the CO2 greenhouse gas stuff they're going after. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is then like what will come after automobiles if they do this. And we can talk about process and timing and some of that kind of stuff as well. But so a lot to still, it's just really, it's open for public comment right now. So there's a lot still that we're going to see on this space.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that PM 2.5, PM 10, so like the really small particulate matter that like hurts our lungs, is still going to be regulated. So there's still going to be basically filters in exhaust pipes, right? Like that's what we're talking about. But not so much limits on like how much CO2 a combustion engine vehicle can emit. If this goes through, and we don't know if it goes through. Aren't there states, like I'm thinking of California, but like aren't there states where these standards are actually set at the state level?
Yep. And California is the exception right now. So because this ruling by the EPA was a federal rule, in order for states to do their own regulations like California had or has done, they've had to get permission from the federal government. So California got permission from the federal government under the Biden administration to do their own automobile kind of greenhouse gas emission rules, going above and beyond what the EPA has set in place. The thing that will be interesting going forward is if the endangerment finding is rolled back, then there's been legal precedents that the endangerment finding and the Clean Air Act is the federal standard, and therefore states haven't been able to do their own thing. If that goes away, there's a chance, and something I'm interested to get Bob Stout's legal kind of input on and stuff when I interview him, is that this may actually change the remit, and more states may be able to go and do their own thing.
Okay, so it will not just be California, who are always like the greenest, the fastest, the most progressive. It can actually be more states who like step in and say
potentially. You know, it's something that's potentially going to get challenged in the courts, and if the EPA isn't there as a legal precedent, or if the Clean Air Act isn't there as a legal precedent on the endangerment finding, then the ability for states to do their own thing is something that we could absolutely see. It's not a guaranteed, but again, the US is very litigious, and so it's probably something that's going to play out.
I agree. I'm always terrified.
It's probably something that is going to play out.
You can sue me for. Okay, but so basically we're saying that DOE put out a report that said CO2 is not that bad. The EPA is now having to repeal the endangerment finding, because the endangerment finding said CO2 really is harmful to humans.
Yep.
A couple of weeks ago, like I don't know if this was big in the States, but a couple of weeks ago, the International Court of Justice actually ruled that climate change, that states have an obligation to tackle climate change, because climate change is harmful to humans. So now there's sort of like this international court ruling that says that you haven't, like, as a state, you have responsibility towards your people. You have an obligation to do something about this. Yep. And then you have the Department of Energy in the U.S. saying, like, this is actually not so bad. Is there any discussion about this, like, tension of, like, international versus national law?
I haven't seen a lot on that. I think from my reading from that international court piece as well, and I'd be curious if this was the same take you had as well, was that it's, even though it does set a pretty big precedent, which is amazing, to be honest, but it's non-binding. And I think that'll be the piece that is, we've seen here in the US with this current administration that they have been quite happy to ignore court orders that are binding. And so anything that's non-binding, I don't think is even going to register. And so I haven't really heard a lot about it in the news coverage and like the podcasts and people I follow around the international piece. It sort of, I read one headline on it and it sort of disappeared, whereas the EPA one's been a little bit more persistent. So, but I'm curious with how was that finding like reported on and translated in Europe? Like, you know, what did you see in that space in your circles as well?
How was the EPA?
Not the EPA, the International Court ruling.
The International Court ruling. So that got a lot of media attention. I mean, so did the EPA, but I would say the ICJ ruling got more attention. I mean, generally, honestly, it was welcomed, right? As in, like, I think that we have a much more, I don't want to say pro-regulation stance, but like I think we have a much more general understanding of like the climate impacts that we're all exposed to, right? As in, like, I don't know, like the area where I used to live in Switzerland, like half the mountain came down, right? The area where I grew up in Germany, like it's constantly getting flooded. Where I'm right now in Portugal, right, like there's wildfires all over. Like you can't, like there's certain tourist areas you can't enter anymore. So I think generally speaking, like this idea of there being an international court of justice and them taking a stance, like making that an obligation, like that was really positively received. I actually think the trick here is that, like, you know, the ICC, the ICJ, like all these international courts, like they only have jurisdiction if your member state becomes a member of that court system.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But, yeah, the US traditionally hasn't joined, so it's hard. But like I have seen a little bit, like I've seen a few articles of people like speculating whether or not this court ruling might lead to more litigation in the US as well, just because there is an international basis.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that I've seen reported on a little bit. And again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't speak legal speak, but because there's been a precedent, because of that original Supreme Court finding, and then there's been subsequent Supreme Court cases around the Clean Air Act in the US, by repealing all of that and getting rid of precedent, it means that there could be more legal challenges against fossil fuel companies, automobile companies, power plants and stuff at a federal level. So all of the climate litigation that we've seen here in the US has been at a state level, because at the federal level, there's been precedent that it's all covered by the Clean Air Act. And so, you know, that's okay. And so suddenly if it's not, then we could start to see a lot more federal challenges to that. And then with the precedent set by the International Court, you know, it could be a really tricky time.
But then you create this crazy patchwork, no? Like every state would regulate themselves.
Yes.
So if you're a company that has operations in multiple jurisdictions, like in multiple states, it becomes a compliance nightmare because you can sell your car here but not there.
Yeah, and I think the oil and gas industry has been dealing with this for a little bit, because I don't think a lot of people are aware, but most of the oil and gas production in the US is managed by the states. And so companies that produce in different states have different rules that they need to abide by and things like that. For a car manufacturer, though, under this kind of ruling, it'll be really interesting, because obviously like oil and gas infrastructure and power plant infrastructure is fixed, right? You put it in the state, it's there, it's not moving. But from a car situation, like people move between states and, you know, I mean, I've driven cross country a few times and I've moved cars between states, moving and things like that. Like if you register a car in one state and then go to register in another state, like, you know, like it's going to be an absolute nightmare. And it potentially will just lead the auto manufacturers to make cars to the strictest standards. So say a California or something like that, which in and of itself is potentially going to be more strict than what the EPA does anyway. So it's, otherwise, how are people going to comply on an individual level? Like, and if a car manufacturer doesn't comply nationally, maybe people won't buy their cars, right? So there's so much here
and
that
the whole logic
could be really
was around the
challenging.
social cost, right? Like, so the whole logic in the DOE paper was around like, what's the cost of regulating this, and like, how's it going to impact the consumer? But now, if like all these states all put in different rules and regulations, it's going to impact the consumer so much more, and the cost is actually potentially much higher. I mean, I'm just imagining this like going through like 50 legislative processes rather than one.
Yeah, rather than one. It's going to be a really interesting process, and I think the cost piece of energy, and whether it's cars or actually, you know, people just having electricity in their homes and stuff like that, I think is going to be a big piece of it, because given that this initial piece of the EPA is just going after the automobile sector, there's a big conversation then around it's around trying to protect US automobile manufacturers, right, which has been part of the whole tariff conversation. The challenge is that for US automobile makers, there's sort of two pieces, and I wrote about this in the first piece I did, is that US automobile companies are relying on the import of raw materials like steel and all sorts of things, batteries and parts from other parts of the world that are now subject to tariffs. And so the cost of purchasing an internal combustion engine or an electric vehicle engine in the US is going to continue to go up. And the average cost, I think I pulled up the article, I think the average price for a internal combustion engine car in the US is now $56,000, and an electric vehicle is $59,000 without the rebates and stuff. That is outrageous.
Is that
Like
US money? US
US
manufactured?
dollars. Yeah,
Okay.
US dollars.
Not in, like, is that for cars that are manufactured in the US, or is that including like cheap imports from wherever?
It's a good question, actually. I would need to double check the source for that. I'm assuming, although I would have to double check, that it's for US produced vehicles, but it's a good question.
Because I mean, all the cheap stuff comes from China, right? And then at the same
Yeah.
time, like you're hitting, not you personally, the US is hitting Europe, for example, with like 15% like blanket covered tariffs, right? And like, what do we export to the US? We export pharmaceuticals and we export cars, right? So like,
Yep.
one way to look at this, and I don't know if that's the right way to look at this, but like one way to look at this is that this is basically a really protectionist package, right? Of like the
Yep.
EPA rescinds the DOE report, the tariffs that come at the same time, right? Like in a way, like is Trump trying to re-stimulate like American auto manufacturing? Is that what's happening?
The conversation around the tariffs here in the US generally has been around we need to make things in the US, full stop. But the challenge with that is that and we're starting to see this even from like small companies and things like that, that like the challenge is that it's not the end products that are being tariffed, everything is being tariffed. And so this is where if it was just around protection of manufacturing, it would just be the end products that were being tariffed. And that's what, to be honest, that's what the Biden administration was doing with Chinese electric vehicles, is that the Biden administration increased tariffs on Chinese EVs from 25% to 100%. So if a Chinese EV was $10,000 to buy it in the US, it would be $20,000. Essentially, they doubled the price of those. And specifically to give US EV manufacturers a chance. You know, there was also then rebates and stuff on EVs here in the US that have now been rolled back as part of the recent OBBA Act that was passed by Congress as well. And so even though the idea is to try and stimulate, in this case, automobile manufacturing, because all the parts are tariffed, as well as the end product from China on an EV basis that are so much cheaper, it'll be interesting to see. And again, it's going to take a few years, right, for us to actually see what the impacts of these things were and stuff. Like none of these supply chains and manufacturing processes change overnight. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, because there is a lot of pressure on the administration around prices in the US. Everything has gotten horrendously expensive. I've seen that just in my, just going to the grocery store and things like that. I bought my coffee yesterday. It's double what it used to be to buy my bag of coffee beans. And again, coffee is one of these things that the US,
Is that since
except for
like you're already feeling the difference?
yeah, we're already
Crazy.
seeing some of this stuff. And like, coffee is an interesting conversation because there are very few places in the US that we can actually grow coffee. Hawaii is one of them, but it's such a small industry. We import almost all of our coffee into the US. And like I said, my bag of coffee beans yesterday was double what it used to be. I still bought it because I live on coffee, but so does a lot of
Very
the
healthy.
US.
Healthy choices.
Got my coffee. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, all
so-
this, right? So like,
Anyway.
things are getting more expensive. Presumably, people are going to consume less. I mean, I kind of see this going two ways, right? So like overall, like prices go up, consumption goes down. Ironically, this is actually not a bad thing for the climate. It's bad for people, right? It's bad for households. It's bad for inequality. Like it really like exacerbates social issues. But for the climate, if overall we consume less, or the other pathway I was going to say, like if we start manufacturing and producing more locally, for the climate, tariffs aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of stuff written, particularly earlier this year, around the fact that a lot of the pro-climate people who often sit on the left have always been about some of this stuff, that we should always be doing local manufacturing, even if it costs more and some of that kind of stuff,
It's
exactly for
local
that reason.
jobs, right? Like
Yeah.
it's local jobs. It's shorter value chains. It's more supply chain security, right? Is like you're going to be less exposed to international shocks. Like it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, it's just it's around it's kind of it's a really interesting kind of piece on it. I think the fact that the tariffs right now are it's not to protect any one industry, it's on everything. It's haphazard. It's 10% one week and 50% the next week, and then it's on hold and stuff like that. The uncertainty and it's the irony, going back to the EPA stuff, is Lee Zeldin, who's the director of the EPA, talked about the fact that this rollback for the EPA would bring, which again was from 16 years ago, so it's been in place for 16 years, would bring certainty for car manufacturers. To roll back something that's been in place for 16 years. I'm like, that's insane, given what we are seeing with the volatility in the actual market around tariffs and stuff. Like that is going to have, that uncertainty is going to have more of an impact on manufacturing, whether it's automobiles or anything, than rolling back. And again, things have changed and the markets have changed significantly since 2009, where the increase in EVs, the cost, we sort of talked about the Chinese EVs, the cost of the Chinese EVs is so low that the international penetration of Chinese EVs is sort of staggering, to be honest, in terms of, and I was having a conversation with someone last week about like, are we worried that like Chinese EVs are going to become like a throwaway commodity? And I'm like, at $4,000, potentially, right? Like they'll become like a phone or something, which is, again, that's not good for the environment either, because what do we do with all those batteries and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah,
so it's
material usage.
there's
Yeah,
no,
for sure.
yeah. So like this balance of like environment and cost is this ongoing sort of tension and challenge that I just, when we look back at all of these things, in a couple of years, in 10 years time, it'll be like, okay, what were actually the things that actually did make a change and which ones didn't and stuff. And my view on the EPA rollback is that, particularly for the automobile sector, I think the market has moved too far from internal combustion engines to EVs, with the adoption of some of that I just don't know. And then given that people can't afford to buy a car in the US anyway, and they're going to keep their existing cars and stuff like that, I just don't know that it's going to move the needle very much on the emissions side of it. I think the bigger pace, and again, we can talk about this later, but I think the bigger target for the EPA on the rollback is power plants. They've made early indications that that is the target. It's not part of this initial piece, but the people that were sitting behind Trump were the tech CEOs, and they need power for their data centers. And there's been a lot of conversation around that in the US. That dominates
So they
all
want
of
a
my
lot of power. They
conversation.
want cheap power. They want it now.
Yep. And so I think that's the bigger play with the EPA stuff. And I think that could have bigger ramifications in terms of emissions. So there's a lot still coming on that. I've got another piece coming out on my take on the power side of the EPA rollback. And so, yeah, we haven't heard the end of it. The public comment.
We are at the half-hour mark, and we promised that we weren't
Yeah.
going to yap so much this time.
We have been yapping away for half an hour,
we
so.
do want to. Okay, I really want to keep talking about tariffs because I think it's a fascinating topic. I know you're keen to get into European energy policy, so I think we can do a wrap-up of like what's happening on the European side.
I think that would be great, right? Because it's been obviously, the Europe energy conversation and how that impacts EU climate policy. I think is a fascinating conversation. So we'll save that for next time.
Let's
because, like
get
you
into
said,
that next time. And thank you so much for today.
This has been great. Thanks, Theresa.
Thanks, Dan.